Thank you for tuning into Short Fiction Lab. You're listening to The Warlord's Ghost, Part 1, Second Skin. Darius Reed died on a Tuesday. He didn't feel it coming. That was the part that stayed with him. Even after everything else faded, that part stayed. 3 years of surviving the impossible, and the end came quietly. A parking garage, a turned back, and Garrett's knife finding the gap between his ribs with a precision that could only come from someone who had watched him fight 100 times and learned exactly where he left himself open. The concrete floor came up to meet his face. He heard his own blood spreading beneath his cheek. Garrett's footsteps echoed away into the dark without hesitating, without stopping, without a single word. Just boots on concrete, and then silence, and then nothing, then light, then a ceiling he recognized. His own ceiling. His own apartment. The water stain in the upper left corner that he'd been meaning to report to the landlord for 2 years. The smell of the place, coffee and old leather, and the faint mildew from the bathroom window he never remembered to close all the way. His bed underneath him, firm and familiar, the same mattress he'd had since he was 22. Darius sat up. His hands were in front of his face before he was fully conscious. His fighter's instinct, reaching for threats before his eyes had adjusted. He found no threats. He found his own hands, his own actual hands. The right one with the 2 missing knuckles from a pipe fight in year 2. The left with the burn scar along the palm from a fire in a warehouse he'd been stupid enough to shelter in during year 1. The scar was there. The knuckles were there. But the scar was pink and new. The knuckles were healed smooth, not the hardened, recalloused ridges he remembered. He got up and went to the bathroom mirror. He looked at himself for a long time. He was young, not a teenager himself, recognizably himself, but young in the way he hadn't been for years. The deep lines around his eyes were gone. The scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, courtesy of a raider's machete in month 8, was absent. His face was the face he'd had before all of it, before 3 years of the end of the world had carved itself into him. He gripped the sink with both hands and let himself breathe. His phone was on the bathroom counter. He picked it up. The date on the screen read October 14th. He knew that date. He knew exactly what came 31 days after it. He stood in his kitchen and drank a full glass of water and let the reality settle over him. He was back. Not in someone else's body, not displaced into a stranger's life. Back in his own apartment, his own body, his own name. 31 days before the world ended. The fury came first. 3 years of surviving, of building, of making every brutal right call. Gone. Erased. He had to do all of it again. And underneath the fury was something else. Something colder and more focused. A word that formed before he'd even finished his first glass of water. Garrett. In his first life, Garrett Cole had been his lieutenant for 2 years. Darius had recruited him in month 4 of the outbreak, trained him personally, trusted him with operations Darius couldn't run himself. Garrett was smart and efficient, and completely without sentiment, which Darius had once considered a strength. He understood now that it had been a warning he'd ignored. In this life, Garrett Cole was somewhere in this city right now, living his ordinary pre-apocalypse existence, not yet the man who would put a knife between Darius's ribs. He was a potential. A future threat. A problem Darius had 31 days to get ahead of. But first, he had 31 days to build everything he hadn't had the first time. He set down the glass and got to work. Part 2. Preparation. The first thing he did was write. He sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen and wrote for 4 hours without stopping. Everything. Every piece of hard-won knowledge from 3 years of surviving things that killed most people. He wrote about infection timelines, how fast a bite moved in heat versus cold, the window between exposure and full turn, the early behavioral markers that most survivors missed until it was too late. He wrote about which supplies ran out first and in what order. He wrote about infrastructure failure sequences, power, water, communication, and exactly how long each one held before it collapsed. He wrote about fighting, not theory, specifics. The mechanics of a clean head strike with a blunt weapon. The difference between a pipe, a bat, and a length of rebar in terms of weight, reach, and what happened to your wrist after the 20th swing. Why edged weapons required more precision and less endurance. Why silence in combat was worth more than almost any tactical advantage. Because noise drew more and more, always compounded the problem. He wrote about Garrett. Everything he knew, how Garrett thought, how he operated, his patterns and preferences, and the specific way he built trust before he exploited it. He wrote it all down not because he'd forget, but because seeing it on paper made it tactical rather than personal. By the time he finished, he had 7 pages and a plan. He started training that afternoon. His body was his own, and it was healthy. He was 31 years old, reasonably fit in the way that a man who occasionally went to a gym could be called fit. But he knew the difference between that and what he needed to be. In his first life, his body had been built by necessity, forged by 18 months of constant physical demand before it became something genuinely dangerous. He didn't have 18 months. He had 31 days, and he was going to compress as much of that forging as he could into that window. He ran 5 miles that first evening. He ran it at a pace that was slightly faster than comfortable, and he did not stop when his lungs complained. He knew his body's actual limits versus its perceived limits, and the gap between them was where adaptation happened. He pushed into that gap and stayed there. He was back home, stretching in his living room, when his neighbor knocked on the door to ask if everything was okay because she'd seen him sprint past her window 3 times and he looked like he was running from something. He told her he was training for a race. She accepted that. He did not sleep until he'd also done 200 push-ups in sets of 40, 100 pull-ups on the bar he'd had mounted in his doorframe since his mid-20s, and 30 minutes of the footwork drills he'd learned from a former boxer who'd survived the first winter in a community center on the east side. He went to bed with his arms shaking and was up at 5 in the morning to do it again. The supply acquisition started on day 2. He had money, not a lot, but enough, and he knew exactly how to spend it. He hit 4 different grocery stores across 3 days, buying from each in quantities that wouldn't attract notice. Rice, dried beans, lentils, oats, canned protein, tuna, chicken, sardines. High calorie, long shelf life, lightweight. He bought water purification tablets from a camping store, $50 worth, enough to process hundreds of gallons. He bought a quality water filter from the same store and told the cashier he was going on a backpacking trip. He was methodical about medical supplies. 2 different pharmacies, small purchases each time. Gauze, medical tape, antiseptic, suture kits, a broad-spectrum antibiotic he had a prescription for and refilled immediately. Ibuprofen in bulk. 2 tourniquets from a medical supply website, expedited shipping. A trauma kit that he had ordered before he'd even thought about the groceries. Because in his first life, he had watched people die from injuries that a $20 kit would have prevented. Tools next. A hardware store on the north side where he didn't usually shop. Duct tape, paracord, bolt cutters, a pry bar, a hand crank emergency radio. A good fixed blade knife, not his first one, that had come from a sporting goods store and had been adequate. This time he bought a quality blade, full tang, 8-inch, the kind of knife that would still be functional after 2 years of hard use. He hid everything in his storage unit in the building's basement. He had never used it for anything except boxes of books he intended to donate and hadn't gotten around to. He cleared the boxes out and built his cache along the back wall, organized by category, inventory listed on a card he taped inside the door. He looked at it when he was done and thought, in my first life, I would have given anything to start with this. He scouted the city for a week. He already knew the city, had lived here his whole life, had navigated it for 3 years after the collapse. But knowing a city in the apocalypse and knowing it before were different things, and he needed the before version to plan the after version. He drove different routes every day, looking at everything with the eyes of a man who was designing a survival operation. He was looking for structural assets, buildings with single defensible entry points, elevated positions with clear sight lines, locations with natural water access or large-scale food storage. He found a building on the 4th day, a 7-story warehouse conversion on the edge of the industrial district 3 blocks from a river. The upper 2 floors had been partially renovated into loft spaces that the developer hadn't sold. The lower floors were empty storage. 1 vehicle entrance at street level with a rolling steel door. 1 pedestrian entrance at the rear. A roof with unobstructed views in every direction, and a water tank that, if the municipal supply failed, could be refilled from the river with his filtration gear. He knew the building's owner from a business connection years ago. He called him and offered to rent the top floor for storage, paid 3 months in advance in cash, and got a full set of keys. He spent the next week moving his cash in. He also mapped every route in a 2-mile radius around the building. Every alley, every cut-through, every dead end that could become a trap. He noted which streets would become gridlocked in a mass exodus, the wide arterials that everyone would instinctively use, and mapped the alternative routes that most people wouldn't think of. He noted the grocery store distribution warehouse 4 blocks north, the hospital 6 blocks east, the elementary school 2 blocks south with its cafeteria dry storage. He wrote all of it down in a notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. He updated it every day. His training intensified in the second week. He had been running every morning and doing body weight work every evening, and he could already feel the change, his body remembering what it was capable of, old muscle groups waking back up. But he needed more than fitness. He needed combat readiness. He found a boxing gym 7 blocks from his apartment and paid for an open training membership. He went every day. He told the trainers he was getting back into it after a long break and wanted to work on fundamentals. That was true in a way they couldn't understand. He drilled the basics: footwork, guard, head movement, the mechanics of a clean cross, and let the muscle memory from his first life guide his hands. The trainers thought he was a fast learner. He did not explain. He also practiced with the knife. Not in the gym, in his apartment, late at night, in the cleared-out living room with the furniture pushed to the walls. He drilled draw speed and the specific strikes that mattered in close quarters, the thrust to the throat, the upward angle to the eye socket, the hooking cut that created enough damage to break a grip. He drilled transitions, what to do when the knife wasn't an option and he had to go empty-handed, what to do when he was on the ground, what to do when there were multiple. In his first life, he had learned all of this from experience, which meant he had also learned it from failure, from wounds and close calls, and the specific education of nearly dying. This time he was building it in without paying that tuition. He ran 10 miles in the 3rd week. He ran it in under 80 minutes with a 30-pound pack. He came home and did pull-ups until his grip failed, and then he ate everything in the refrigerator. By day 28, he looked like a different man than the one who had woken up on October 14th. The softness was gone. The lines were back, not the deep lines of 3 years of apocalypse survival, but the sharp definition of a body that had been pushed hard for 4 weeks. He looked in the mirror and recognized the man looking back. Not Darius Reed before the outbreak. Something between that man and the warlord he'd become. Something better, maybe, than either. Part 3, Day 1. The outbreak came on a Thursday morning. Darius was already awake. He had been awake since 4, running his final checklist. The cash in the warehouse was fully stocked. He had mapped 3 separate routes to the building. He had a go bag packed by his front door. The knife, 2 days of food, the trauma kit, water filter, paracord, the bolt cutters, a change of clothes, the notebook. He had been sleeping in his clothes for the last 3 days. He was eating breakfast when his phone started showing emergency alerts. He read the first one and put the phone face down on the table and finished eating. He needed the calories. Whatever was coming in the next hour, he needed to be fueled. He picked up his go bag, locked his apartment, and walked down to his car. The street was quiet but wrong. He could feel it, the specific quality of a silence that was about to end. 2 neighbors were standing in front of the building looking at their phones. A car moved past too fast for the residential street. Somewhere to the east, someone was shouting. He drove toward the warehouse. He was 8 blocks out when the first gridlock started forming on the main arterial to his left. He took his pre-mapped alternate route without hesitating. He was at the warehouse in 11 minutes. He pulled inside, rolled the steel door shut behind him, and locked it. Then he went up to the roof and watched the city begin to come apart. He had given himself 1 day of solo operation before he started building a crew. In his first life, he had operated alone for 6 months before necessity pushed him toward other people, and 6 months of solo survival had been efficient but costly in ways he hadn't recognized at the time. This time, he was not going to wait. He had already identified 3 people. Marcus Webb lived in the apartment building across the street from the warehouse. Darius had noticed him 2 weeks earlier during a scouting pass, a man in his mid-30s who had been quietly moving boxes of what looked like emergency supplies into his car in a way that suggested he had been thinking about this before anyone else was. Darius had watched him for 3 days and confirmed what he suspected. Marcus was already prepared, or close to it. He had the instincts. Elena Vasquez worked at the hospital 6 blocks east. Darius had met her briefly in his first life, about 8 months in, when her survivor group and his had briefly shared a supply depot. She had been a trauma nurse. She had been absolutely invaluable and had died in month 14 from a secondary infection that Darius could have prevented if he'd had better medical supplies at the time. He intended to reach her before the hospital became a death trap. And there was Coach Reyes, who ran the boxing gym where Darius had been training. A former military man who had kept himself in serious shape, who moved through space with the awareness of someone who had been trained to always know where the exits were. Darius had sparred with him twice in the past week and confirmed that the man was both a skilled fighter and, more importantly, the kind of person who stayed calm when things got loud. He went out on the afternoon of day 1 to find them. The streets were deteriorating fast. He came out through the rear pedestrian entrance and moved north, staying close to the building line, watching ahead. The infected were already present, not the dense saturation that would come in weeks 2 and 3, but scattered individuals in small clusters, the recently turned still confused by what they'd become. He passed 2 on the first block. They were fixated on a car alarm going off across the street and didn't track him. He gave them 40 feet of clearance and kept moving. The third block was where it got complicated. A group of 5 infected had formed at a corner, drawn together by some convergence of sound and movement, jostling and overlapping, working themselves into a collective agitation that Darius recognized as the precursor to a directed rush. He stopped, assessed. The building to his right had a recessed loading bay. He stepped into it and waited. They moved past, following something he couldn't see from his position, heading west down the cross street. He let them clear and moved on. He found Marcus in the parking structure next to the apartment building. The man was loading a sedan with supplies, fast and methodical, head on a swivel. When he heard Darius's footsteps, he spun around with a tire iron in his hand and a look on his face that was ready to use it. "I'm not infected," Darius said. He kept his hands visible. "I've got a secured building 3 blocks south. Defensible, stocked, roof access. I'm building a group. You look like someone who's been thinking about exactly this situation." Marcus stared at him. "I don't know you." "No, but you're standing in an open parking structure loading a car that you don't have time to drive out of this city before the roads close." "You know I'm right about that." Marcus looked at his car, looked at the tire iron in his hand, looked at the street behind Darius, where the sounds were getting louder. "What's your name?" Marcus said. "Darius Reed. I live 2 blocks from here. I've been prepping for this for a month." "A month?" Marcus said it flatly. "Bring everything you've got. We move in 5 minutes." Marcus hesitated for exactly 4 more seconds. Then he started loading his arms. Elena was still at the hospital when Darius reached it. The main entrance was a disaster. Cars in the drop-off lane that had been abandoned. A crowd of people pushing against the glass doors. 3 infected already moving through the parking lot in tight, agitated circles. He went to the staff entrance on the east side, the one he'd identified 2 weeks ago during his scouting pass. He found Elena in the stairwell, coming down with a bag over each shoulder. She stopped when she saw him blocking the stairwell. Her hand went immediately to the bag strap like it could serve as a weapon. "Trauma nurse?" he said. "Who are you?" "Someone with a secured location and no medical expertise." He met her eyes. "You're leaving." The hospital isn't tenable in the next 6 hours. Where are you going? She looked at him hard. I have a plan. So do I. Mine has 4 walls, a steel door, roof access, and a month of food storage. He paused. What's yours? A long moment. Through the stairwell door, they could hear the hospital changing, raised voices, something crashing, a specific escalating register of a building losing control of itself. 3 blocks south, she said. He blinked. How did you? That warehouse on Crane Street has been occupied for 2 weeks. I noticed the lights. She adjusted the bags on her shoulders. I was hoping whoever was in there wasn't dangerous. I'm not, he said, most of the time. She went past him down the stairs without another word. He followed. They ran into serious trouble 2 blocks from the warehouse. A cluster of 12 infected had formed across the street, blocking the most direct route. Not scattered individuals, a true group, drawn together and orienting in the same direction with that flock-like coordination that Darius had learned to identify. They hadn't locked onto his group yet. They were tracking something else, something to the north. But the route home went directly through them. He stopped the group, Marcus, Elena, and Coach Reyes, who Darius had found at the gym on his way back, standing in the locked doorway with a duffel bag and a look of complete unsurprise. Darius hand-signaled them to hold. He studied the cluster. The lead infected, the one setting the orientation for the rest, was a heavy-set man in a delivery uniform. The others were loosely arrayed behind him. Not tight, not organized, but connected in that way they got when one of them had a strong fixation. Break the fixation, the group would disperse or reorient. He pulled a road flare from his go bag, held it up so the group could see it. When I throw this, they go for the light and the noise, he said quietly. We go left, tight against the building wall, fast. Don't run past them, go around. How do you know that works? Coach Reyes said. I've done it. He cracked the flare. The red light bloomed in his hand, bright even in daylight. He threw it high and long to the right, putting it down 50 feet north of the cluster. Every head in the group snapped right. Move, Darius said. They moved left in a tight column, fast and quiet, pressing against the brick wall of the building on their side of the street. The infected were orienting toward the flare, the lead one already shuffling north, with the rest pulling behind it like a current. Darius kept his eyes on the nearest one as they passed. A woman in a business suit, jaw working, eyes completely gone, and she never turned. They cleared the cluster with 15 feet to spare and put the corner between themselves and the group. 2 blocks, no contact. He had the rear steel door open 30 seconds later. They went inside, and he pulled it shut and dropped the bar. In the new silence, the 4 of them stood in the dim loading bay catching their breath. Flare trick, Marcus said. That's good. Write it down, Darius said. Write everything down. We're building a manual. Elena was already pulling a notebook from her bag. She had apparently come to the same conclusion independently. Part 4. The Crew. The first 2 weeks were about learning to function. Darius organized the warehouse by zone. The top floor was sleeping and personal space. The floor below was supplies and equipment, with an inventory he updated every day, quantities consumed, quantities remaining, projected burn rate, what they needed to prioritize in the next foraging run. The ground floor was the operational base, the maps, the planning, the gear maintenance. The roof was the observation post, 2-person watch in 4-hour rotations, every hour of every day. He set rules on the first night and explained every one of them. No solo movement outside the building. Not because he didn't trust their individual judgment. He did. But because the margin for error outside was 0 and having a partner wasn't a courtesy. It was a structural safety feature. Every exit and return had to be logged on the board by the door. Who, where, when expected back. If someone wasn't back within an hour of their expected time, the remaining crew mobilized. Noise discipline inside the building. Not silence. Silence was unsustainable and made people tense in ways that degraded their performance. But controlled volume, nothing that carried to the street. The infected tracked sound. The building was quiet enough that a normal conversation inside couldn't be heard from outside, but shouting could. No shouting. Full debrief after every outside run. Everything seen, everything encountered, anything that had changed since the last run. Information was survival. A cluster that had moved, a new blocked route, a building that had been looted. All of it went on the board, all of it fed back into the planning. The crew absorbed the rules without resistance, which told him something good about each of them. Marcus turned out to be exactly what Darius had assessed him as. A systems thinker of the first order. On day 3, he had mapped the building's entire utility infrastructure, water, gas, electrical, and produced a list of modifications that would extend their survivability significantly. On day 5, he had rigged a rudimentary alarm system across all ground floor entry points using fishing line, small bells, and a geometry that meant any entry would trigger sound at the observation post before it could reach the sleeping floor. On day 8, he had identified a solar panel array on the adjacent building's roof, accessible via a makeshift bridge he built himself, and wired 3 panels to a battery bank that kept their radios and flashlights charged indefinitely. "I want to talk about the water tank on the roof," he said on day 9. "Talk," Darius said. "It's got capacity for about 2,000 gallons. Municipal water is going to fail. I'm estimating 10 to 14 days based on what I know about how those systems work. If we fill the tank before that happens, and we run the filtration system for everything we consume, we can be water independent for months." "Do it today," Darius said, "before anything else." Marcus had it done by evening. Alina ran the medical operation with a thoroughness that Darius found genuinely impressive, even measured against his own experience. She had come out of the hospital with both supply bags full of exactly the right things. Not random grabs, but targeted selection. The kind that came from years of knowing what actually mattered in a trauma situation. She set up a treatment area on the top floor, cataloged everything she had, and produced a written protocol for the most common injuries they were likely to encounter. She also spent 2 hours with each member of the crew, going through the basics of wound care, because she said, correctly, that the best medical plan was one that didn't require a nurse to implement. "If I'm the one who's hurt," she said, "you need to know how to help me." Coach Reyes was the crew's combat trainer. Darius had claimed that role himself initially, and then watched the first sparring session between Reyes and Marcus and revised his thinking. Reyes was a better technical instructor than Darius, cleaner at breaking down mechanics, more patient with repetition, better at identifying and correcting specific flaws. Darius knew more about what the fights outside actually looked like. They split it. Reyes taught the mechanics, Darius taught the application. Every morning, before the day's operations, the crew trained for 90 minutes. Footwork, guard, strikes, takedown, defense. Then Darius would run a scenario. Specific situations they might encounter, specific problems they'd need to solve in under 3 seconds. He ran them from what had actually happened in his first life. He didn't say that. He just said he'd been thinking through possibilities. They got better fast, faster than he expected. These were adults with full physical development, motivated by the most compelling possible incentive. By the end of week 2, none of them hesitated. By the end of week 3, the hesitation had been replaced by a controlled decisiveness that was different from hesitation in every important way. Part 5. The work outside. The foraging runs started on day 4. Darius led the first 3 himself, taking one partner each time, running the routes he had mapped in the weeks before the outbreak. He wanted to see how the real conditions matched his projections. Mostly they did. The grocery store on 5th was stripped to the walls, as expected. The pharmacy on Mercer had been hit hard, but not completely. The back stockroom, accessible only through a door behind the counter, had been overlooked. They came back from that run with $600 worth of medication that no one had thought to take. The distribution warehouse 4 blocks north was the big score. Darius had expected competition there and planned accordingly. He and Coach Reyes went in heavy, fully equipped, expecting to find other survivors or raider activity. What they found was an unlocked loading bay and 30,000 pounds of dry goods that nobody had reached yet because the warehouse wasn't visible from any main street. It took 4 runs over 2 days to move the most valuable portion of it back to the warehouse. They used a hand cart Darius had found on the first supply run, and a route that he'd specifically identified as clear and consistent. By the end of those 4 runs, the building's food storage had expanded from 3 weeks to 5 months. "How did you know about that warehouse?" Marcus asked on the 3rd run. "I scouted it before the outbreak," Darius said. "Before?" "Yes." A pause. "How far before?" "A few weeks." He kept walking. Eyes up, we're passing the corner of Linden. Marcus looked at Linden, saw nothing, looked back at Darius with an expression that said this conversation was not finished. But he let it go. The fights on the runs were constant. Not always large, more often a single infected in a doorway, or 2 that had clustered around a sound source and needed to be bypassed or removed. Darius handled most of them himself in the early days, quickly and without drama, wanting the crew to see the template before they had to apply it. He was deliberate about the education. "Watch the feet," he told them after a takedown on the 7th day, standing over the downed infected with his knife already resheathed. "They tell you the direction before the upper body commits. You get a half-second of advance warning if you're watching the feet." "They're not exactly tactical," Elena said. "No, but their mass is real. Their grip is real. If one grabs you and you don't break it immediately, you've already started losing." He looked at each of them. "Break the grip first, everything else second." They practiced grip breaks that evening until everyone could do it reflexively. On day 16, they encountered their first real group. 11 infected in the alley behind the school, drawn there by some convergence of factors, tightly clustered, agitated. The alley was also the most direct route to the school's cafeteria storage, which Elena had identified as a priority target. They couldn't go around. Going around added 6 blocks through an area that had gotten consistently worse over the past 4 days. They stood at the alley entrance and looked at the group. 11, Coach Reyes said quietly. "Yes, 4 of us." "Yes." Darius studied the cluster. He identified the lead infected, a man near the front who was orienting the group's energy. He looked at the sight lines. He looked at the alley's width and length and what was on each side. He made a decision. "We're not going through them as a group. Marcus and Elena, you stay at this entrance and make noise on my signal. Controlled noise, something you can stop immediately. Coach, you're with me. We go through the service entrance on the north side, come up behind the cluster, draw the lead away from the front. When the cluster splits, Marcus and Elena push through the middle." "What's the signal?" Marcus said. Darius held up 2 fingers, then pointed down the alley. "When you see us moving from the north, start. When I put my fist up, stop." He and Coach Reyes went around the block and came in from the north. The service entrance was unlocked. Someone had come through recently. They moved down the alley wall, tight, quiet, tools ready. The cluster was 20 feet ahead, still oriented toward the south entrance, where Marcus and Elena were waiting. Darius clocked the lead infected. He picked up a loose chunk of concrete from the alley floor and threw it past the cluster toward the south end. 11 heads turned. The lead one took 3 steps south, and the rest began following. He hit the lead one from behind. One clean strike with the blunt back of the pry bar to the base of the skull. Precise, practiced, immediate. The infected dropped, and the group's orientation shattered. Coach Reyes was already moving on the nearest one, a swift controlled strike, and then Marcus and Elena were pushing through the now disorganized middle of the cluster, moving fast. 3 of the infected turned toward the new movement. Darius took the first one, Coach Reyes the second. The third got a hand on Elena's bag strap. She broke the grip with the motion they drilled. Wrist over, pull down, create separation, and put the butt of the wrench into its temple hard enough that it folded. She didn't stop moving. 40 seconds. They were through the alley and into the school service corridor. Darius pulled the door shut behind them. Everyone was breathing hard. No one was hurt. "That was clean," Coach Reyes said. "It should be cleaner," Darius said. "We practiced the grip break again tonight." Elena looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. "You've done this before," she said. He held her gaze. "Run like that? Yes. Not what I mean." He said nothing. She let it go, the same way Marcus had, the same way everyone eventually did. They had more immediate things to focus on. Part 6. The Tollkeeper. He found Garrett at the start of month 2. He had been tracking raider activity since day 10, as a background thread running parallel to all other operations. He knew Garrett's patterns, had built them himself, in another life, by teaching Garrett everything he knew. Garrett would move fast in the early days, establishing control of a resource choke point before the landscape settled enough for other groups to contest it. He would be organized, and he would be brutal, and he would use the reputation for brutality as a force multiplier so he didn't always have to demonstrate it directly. The information came from a survivor group they had been trading with for 3 weeks, 4 people who had been moving through the area and had stopped at the warehouse twice to exchange supplies for medical care from Elena. One of them, a former city planner named Howard, who had the useful habit of mentally mapping everything he walked past, described a checkpoint on the main bridge 6 miles east. "One man runs it," Howard said. "His crew calls him the Tollkeeper. He's been there since week 2. Takes half of everything that crosses. If you can't pay, he takes everything." "How many people in the crew?" Darius said. 12. Maybe 14 now. I'm not sure. He was recruiting when we came through." "What does he look like?" Howard described him. Medium height, close-cropped hair. A specific way of standing, weight slightly back, always leaving himself room to move. A scar along the jaw that wasn't there yet, in this life, because Darius hadn't put it there. That was Garrett. Darius spent 2 weeks planning. He scouted the bridge 4 times, each approach from a different direction, always staying in the dead ground where he knew, from experience building similar operations, that the sentries weren't watching. He mapped 14 positions across the bridge and its approaches. He watched rotation schedules over 3 days and identified the pattern. He identified 3 crew members who were operating out of fear rather than loyalty, the ones who watched the exits, who flinched slightly when Garrett raised his voice, who had the look of people waiting for a better option to present itself. He assembled the crew for a full briefing on day 13 of the planning phase. "The bridge controls access to the hospital district," he said. "We need the hospital district before winter. Elena can tell you why better than I can." He glanced at her. She nodded. "The current operation at the bridge is run by a man I know. He's effective, and he will not negotiate sharing access." "Which means we remove him." "You know him," Coach Reyes said. "I knew him before." A pause around the table. Before had become a word with weight in their conversations, a marker for the things Darius knew that he shouldn't, the things he'd mapped that he couldn't have mapped without foreknowledge, the reactions he had to situations before anyone else had processed them. "How do we do it?" Marcus said. Darius put the bridge schematic on the table. "Like this. Part 7. The bridge." They moved out at 3 in the morning. All 4 of them plus Ray, a young man who had arrived at the warehouse 2 weeks earlier and had proven himself on 3 supply runs. 6 people total. Darius had planned the operation for this number, not more, because more people meant more noise and more variables. Not fewer, because the positioning required coverage at 4 separate points. The streets at this hour had their own particular quality. Not safe. Nowhere was safe, but quieter. The infected less active in the deep cold, their movement patterns more predictable. Darius had learned this in his first life and had factored it into the timing. They moved fast, and they moved silent, holding the column formation he'd drilled with them for weeks. 1 block from the bridge, they hit trouble. 4 infected in a cluster, blocking the sidewalk approach. Not a large group, but they were positioned directly in the path, and there was no clean bypass. The road was open on the other side, exposed in going around what put them in sightline of the bridge sentries. Darius held up his fist. The column stopped. He studied the cluster. Close quarters. No room for flares or throws. He looked at Coach Reyes and made a gesture. 2 fingers, pointed left. Coach Reyes understood. They peeled off, 1 on each side of the cluster, coming in from the flanks, while Marcus and Elena held position to prevent the infected from backing into the column. The fight was fast and quiet. Darius took the 2 on the right, the first one with a direct upward strike to the jaw that snapped the head, back and exposed the crown, and then the follow-through strike to the crown that finished it. The second one grabbed for his jacket sleeve, and he let it grab, used the grip as a lever, spinning the infected off balance and driving its skull into the brick wall of the building beside them. Once, twice, it dropped. Coach Reyes had the two on the left down in the same window. He worked with a precision that Darius genuinely respected. No wasted motion, no telegraphing. Each strike delivered with the full mechanical efficiency that came from real training applied to a real situation. 18 seconds. They cleared the area and kept moving. They reached the bridge approach and split into their positions. Darius and Coach Reyes went south, staying low against the embankment. Marcus and Elena took the east approach. Ray held the far side of the vehicle entrance. At 3:15, Marcus triggered the distraction. A battery-powered speaker placed under the bridge 2 hours earlier, programmed to run a loop of engine noise. The sound rose from below the bridge in the darkness, convincing and sharp, and both east side sentries broke position to look down at the water. Darius moved. He came up the south side of the bridge at a run, low and fast, using the vehicle barrier as cover. The first sentry was leaning over the south railing, looking down. Darius came in from behind, and his left arm went across the man's throat, not the windpipe, which caused a fight, but the carotid pressure point on each side, the technique that caused unconsciousness in seconds when applied correctly. The sentry went slack fast. Darius lowered him, zip-tied his wrists, and moved. The second sentry heard something and turned. He was raising a length of pipe when Darius got inside the swing. He drove his elbow into the man's jaw and caught him as he folded, lowered him without noise. Zip-tied, moving. Coach Reyes had the west positions handled by the time Darius reached the center of the bridge. Marcus and Elena pushed through the east approach. Ray held the vehicle entrance. The remaining crew, 8 people, minus the 2 Darius had dropped, minus the 2 who'd broken position for the distraction, were suddenly facing a situation they hadn't been prepared for, confronting it from 4 directions in the dark. 3 put down their weapons. 2 ran north without looking back. 3 made the other choice, and those 3 were handled. And Darius did not look away from any of it, because looking away was how you missed things that could hurt you. Then he walked to the toll booth. Garrett was inside. He'd heard enough to know the operation was blown, and he was moving toward the north exit when Darius stepped into the doorway and blocked it. They were 8 feet apart in the dim interior of the toll booth, one battery lantern throwing orange light between them. Garrett still had the same quality he'd always had. That stillness, that readiness, the absolute absence of panic in his face, even in a situation that warranted it. He looked at Darius and his eyes moved through the full threat assessment in under 2 seconds. Hands, stance, the positions of whoever was behind him in the dark. Easy, Garrett said. His voice was controlled. Take the bridge. I'll walk. Nobody has to get hurt. That's not how this works, Darius said. You've got my crew tied up. You've got the positions. You've won. He spread his hand slightly. What more do you want? I want you to understand what you're going to stop doing. Darius held his gaze. The toll operation ends tonight. The bridge opens. The people you've been robbing get to cross with what they have. And if I say no? Darius said nothing. He just looked at him. Garrett was good at reading situations. It was one of the things Darius had valued about him once. He watched Garrett read this one, read the positioning, the numbers, the competence of the way the operation had been executed, and arrive at his conclusion. You planned this carefully, Garrett said, for 2 weeks. Who are you? Darius looked at him. He felt the perking garage floor, the sound of footsteps walking away. 3 years of a life ending in a single turn back. He let himself feel it, the full weight of it, and then he set it down. Someone who knew you were going to end up here, Darius said. Someone who decided to come deal with it before it got worse. Garrett's eyes narrowed. That doesn't tell me who you are. No, Darius said. It doesn't. What stops me from rebuilding somewhere else? Nothing, Darius said honestly. But I'll hear about it. And I'll come back. And next time I won't spend 2 weeks planning. I'll just show up. Something moved in Garrett's face. He was reading the statement for truth and finding it. Darius had always been a poor liar when he chose to tell the truth, and he was choosing to tell the truth now. What happens to my crew? Garrett said. The ones who want to come in are welcome. We're not running a charity, but we're not running a prison either. They work, they contribute, they're in. The ones who don't want to can leave. He paused. Same offer applies to you. Once. This is the only time I make it. Garrett looked at him for a long time. His hand was near the knife at his hip, had been the whole conversation, and now it moved away from it. That was the tell Darius had been watching for. You're serious, Garrett said. I'm always serious. Another long pause. The bridge settled around them, the creak of the structure, the water below, the distant sounds of the city at night. Darius waited. He was patient in a way that he had learned the hard way, through years of situations that punished impatience. I'll walk, Garrett said. Darius stepped aside from the doorway. Garrett moved past him. At the threshold he stopped, not turning around. You knew I'd be here, at this bridge, with this operation. Yes. Darius was quiet for a moment. Because you're good at this, he said. And good people find the same solutions to the same problems. I just got here first. Garrett stood in the doorway for another second. Then he walked out onto the bridge and kept walking north and didn't look back. Darius watched him go. Part 8, morning. Sunrise found them holding the bridge. Marcus was already examining the structure's utility hookups, notebook in hand. Elena was running a quick assessment on the 2 crew members who'd taken injuries in the confrontation. Neither serious, both manageable. Coach Reyes was talking with 3 of Garrett's former crew who wanted to stay, sizing them up with the calm patience of someone who had seen enough people to know quickly what they were looking at. Ray had the north approach and was watching the river. Darius stood at the center of the bridge in the early light. The city spread out in both directions. It was broken, and it was dark in places where it used to be lit, and it was never going to go back to what it had been. He knew that better than anyone. He had lived through 3 years of what came next, the long grinding work of surviving in a world that had decided to stop cooperating with human life, and he was going to live through it again. But this time, he had a month of preparation instead of none. This time he had a crew built on actual trust rather than tactical necessity. This time he had arrived at month 2 with a fortified base, 5 months of food, independent water and power, and a medical professional who had come out of the hospital with exactly the right supplies because she knew what she was doing. This time, when Garrett had come to the bridge, Darius had been waiting. You let him go, Coach Reyes said, coming to stand beside him. Yes, you had reason not to. I had a reason? Reason enough? Darius looked north where Garrett had disappeared. I don't know yet. I'll find out. Coach Reyes was quiet for a moment. You knew him. Really knew him. I did. He didn't know you. No. Darius turned from the railing. He knew a version of me that doesn't exist anymore. He walked back toward his crew. Marcus looked up from the utility hookup he was examining and held up his notebook. There's a secondary power junction under this bridge that connects to the hospital district grid. If I can get into the hospital basement, I might be able to restore partial power to the whole sector. How long? Darius said. 2 days, maybe 3. Plan it out. We'll run it this week. Elena was finishing her assessment of the former crew members. She caught Darius's eye and gave him a small nod. They were clean, no bites, no fever. He acknowledged it and kept moving. He went to the north railing and looked out at the river. The water was moving, flat and steady and indifferent. The same water that had been here before any of this and would be here long after. He thought about the parking garage floor. He thought about the sound of footsteps walking away. He thought about the month of mornings he'd spent running in the dark, building this body back into something capable. The lists written at 4 in the morning by a man who had already died once and was not going to do it the same way twice. The crew behind him now, already working, already doing what they did without being told, because they'd built something that ran on its own momentum. He had come back with one objective: survive better this time. Don't make the same mistakes. Don't trust the wrong people. Don't get the knife between the ribs. He had done those things. He had done more than those things. Somewhere in the last 30 days, The objective had expanded. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building something. It had a shape he hadn't planned for, and people in it he genuinely cared about, and a direction that had nothing to do with revenge. He stayed at the railing until the sun was fully up. Then he turned around and walked back to his crew. There was work to do, and this time he was not going to waste a single day of it. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please like this video and subscribe to support our channel so that I can bring more stories like this to you.